All righty. Well, as most of you know, we have spent the last 3 or so weeks in a new series called Streams of Living Water. And that series is based off of a book that I read called Streams of Living Water by Richard Foster, in which he kind of unpacks 6 of the major Christian traditions that most churches fall in. Now, before I get deep into this, I believe I'm supposed to dismiss the children, the babies. Where is Debbie or Connie or Mike? Do the youngins have class? It's 4th week. Young people, you're staying with us. Teens, do you have class? Everybody staying with us. Wonderful. I think you'll have a good time. So we've been unpacking this series where we look at these traditions that most churches fall into. And so we've looked at the contemplative tradition, which is a emphasis on a prayer-centered life. And we've looked at the holiness tradition, which is an emphasis on morality and purity and virtue, good living. We've looked at the charismatic tradition, right, which is the spirit-empowered tradition, the exercising of spiritual gifts. We've looked at the evangelical tradition, which is the word-centered and word-proclaiming tradition. We've looked at the social justice tradition, which is the compassionate life, the living for other people and serving of other people. And we've looked at the incarnational tradition, which is the idea that my whole life embodies my faith, that wherever I am, that's where my faith is lived out. And this series is a little bit unique in that as each week we unpack one tradition, the next available week, then we will talk to somebody who has expertise, who has credibility, and who has experience in that field. And so today will be our first interview right here on this stage. And I'm super excited about the lineup. I mean, we have folks that are credentialed down, that are highly educated, and that have a lot of experience. And I think that it's important that we hear from somebody who has firsthand experience, because for some of these traditions, you and I are looking from the outside in. And so you get just a little more depth when you talk to somebody who's had that experience. And so today I'm going to interview a good friend of mine, a mentor of mine, Dr. Gene Maynard, and you will have the opportunity to ask him questions. So be thinking about what it is that you want to know, because he's going to speak to us today about the contemplative tradition. So I'm going to read his biography. If you'll turn with me in your bulletins, I want to brag on him just a little bit. He's one of the most humble people that I know, but I just feel like when you've earned your credentials, they ought to be celebrated. So it says this: Dr. Gene Maynard has been married to his wife, Lori, for 40 years, 41 years in June. That's a long time to be married to somebody, isn't it? They have 3 adult children and 4 grandchildren, ages 7 and 2, that call him Papa. Dr. Maynard grew up on the Nez Perce Chief Joseph Native American Reservation and spent the first 18 years of his life on that reservation and graduated from the reservation high school. He is not Native American by ethnicity, but those first 18 years living in a host culture different than his own shaped his life in powerful and unbelievable ways. He is incredibly happy that God gave him that gift, and some of his passions for cross-cultural ministry and conversation stems from that experience. He holds a bachelor's degree in religion, a master of divinity from Asbury Theological Seminary, and a doctor of ministry in spiritual formation and theology from none other than Princeton Theological Seminary. He has all of the good education of Princeton and none of the snooty attitude. Amen? He's been a pastor for 30 plus years. He began his ministry as a Quaker ordained pastor and pastored among the Quakers for about 15 years. During that time, he was a pastor of the church, watch this, that Richard Foster, who authored the book that we are unpacking, attended. Since then, Dr. Maynard has maintained his ordination as a Quaker pastor, but has been pastoring interdenominational faith communities. He pastored an urban church in Washington, D.C. He pastored a church of about 3,500 plus people in Winnipeg, Canada, where some of our young people will be in a couple of months. And now he pastors the smallest church he has ever pastored, the Upper Room in Auburn, a church of about 125 people. He loves pastoring the Upper Room more than anywhere he has pastored before in ministry. Dr. Maynard is also the director of the Doctor of Ministry program at Epic Bible College and Graduate School, where he teaches many of the doctoral and master's level courses. That's a small plug to Epic. If you are interested in furthering your theological education, listen, he's a great person to talk to about their programs. And what I love about Epic is that it really is education that's accessible to the public. I mean, I've walked into classrooms and been sitting next to people who are currently experiencing homelessness. And so that just says to you how accessible it is and its quality. I mean, they have people from Princeton. It's so quality. I thought about getting my doctoral degree from there, thought about it heavily. While Dr. Maynard is exceptionally accomplished, his heart is for people and spiritual formation practices. He also loves long-distance hiking and backpacking. Now, that's where he and I diverge, amen. I am learning. You know, my good friend David asked me if I would go and climb Mount Shasta. I said, David, you know I'm fat, right? I know I look skinny but underneath the shirt, if you unbutton it, I can't tell you what'll spill out. Dr. Maynard and David probably would be good friends, but listen, I am excited to have Dr. Maynard here, and this is an opportunity for me to kind of pull out some of my journalistic skills. My first degree was in journalism, and so I'm excited to have him talk to us about his experience with the Contemplative Tradition. So will you do me a favor and make him feel real, real welcome by giving him a hand clap of applause as he comes. Welcome, Dr. Maynard. It's all right. Yeah, you right here. How you doing? So you're going to grab your mic and you're going to press it one time so that it's green. No, hold it down. There we go. So first of all, thank you for being here. It means the world to me that you took the time out of your schedule. And I don't know exactly how busy you are, but I know that you do a lot of stuff. You have the Greece trip coming up, and you have a lot going on. And so I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super excited to be here. I love your pastor. I've known Dwight for quite a few years, and you guys got a great pastor. Not because I'm part of this, but I'm just so excited about this kind of format. The conversation like gets us into things that we can't get into, and we just make formal presentations, and we get to just bump into stuff. So can I just put out, like, I've got 3 adult kids and 4 grandchildren, and they tell me really, really quickly when I'm trying to explain things that I get confusing. So I know from family feedback that that's not a gift of mine. So if I confuse you, please slow me down. Say, hey, could you go back and let's cover that again? I'd love that, so we make sure I'm as clear as possible when it comes to these important things we're talking about.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I have questions, of course, about the Contemplative Tradition, but before I get to that, I was reading your biography and I was just blown away by some of this. So before we get into the Contemplative Tradition, how did you end up on a Native American reservation?
Yeah, great question. I ask that myself sometimes. So the long story short, my grandfather. So we could talk a lot about the Nez Perce Reservation and treatment of Native Americans in our culture. It's there's some super sad stories about all of that. One of the sad stories for the Nez Perce tribe, which is unbelievably gifted, creative, artistic, great spirits. But one of the sad things that happened in the land grabs that happened because of gold and so on, they got moved out of their native area, hunting area, got put into an agricultural area, and they literally were starving because they didn't know how to do to use the land for creating crops and feeding their families. So the solution between the tribal leaders and the governmental agency that managed that was to allow pieces of the reservation, which it's right in the part of North Idaho where Oregon, Washington, and Idaho come together, basically all the way over to Montana. It's a huge area. And so they were allowed to sell pieces, and my granddad was a farmer. He got 3,000 acres, was able to purchase it, moved in, and my whole family is still there. So that's how I grew up. So.
Wow, and you talk about how it shaped kind of some of your perspective, and so talk to me about how, I'm just so curious. it's always interesting to me when people are kind of in spaces that they might not normally be in. Sure. How has that shaped you?
Yeah, so a lot of humbling things. I was incredibly. I'm Caucasian. I come from a host culture here in America, but I was in a culture that wasn't my own in terms of some language and practices and so on. So it was learning how to adapt, learning how to I hate to say it, I was incredibly ignorant. I didn't know what my Native friends were experiencing being Native Americans. It went over my head. I've had to go back in time and try to understand and try to learn what Jimmy Redbird was experiencing, my peer in high school, as we would go off of reservation for different things. He'd often make these little comments. He'd turn to some of his Native friends and he'd say, "So you got your passport?" And I just always thought that was the silliest thing in the world until I recognized I was going back into my culture and he was going out of his culture into a place that he sometimes felt unsafe and unsure about. And so it was just an awareness that there was these layers of life. I suppose the most important thing I learned, though, a couple of things, is it finally comes back to me as a human person and a spiritual person. I learned the importance of story, that finally, if you're willing to listen and willing to just be quiet and engage with your ears and hearts, you can learn a lot by hearing stories of people and cultures. So I learned a lot about stories and just listening and valuing stories. And I learned from my own faith commitment at that point in time. So you're into a story about streams of just different traditions. You said you've gone through the evangelical tradition. The church that I grew up in the reservation where I started practicing my faith was in the evangelical tradition. It was great at proclaiming scripture, great at proclaiming gospel. I embraced that, surrendered my life to Christ, but it had absolutely no understanding about penetrating a culture that had a lot of darkness in it and trying to be light there. It wanted to do mission in Japan, it wanted to do mission in Africa. It didn't want to do mission on the reservation. And looking back on that, I found that incredibly sad, and am trying to embrace something different now.
Yeah. So then tell me about kind of your faith journey on that reservation and through that church. You said you surrendered your life to that. What was that call like for you? What has been your walk with Jesus?
Yeah, so the church was very committed to evangelism, very committed with their children and youth, and at a fairly young age, the gospel was presented pretty clearly. I accepted Christ was language of that time, and surrendered my life to Christ would have been language. And I sensed a call into ministry. I know that's kind of an old-fashioned word, but I sensed a tap on the shoulder. Jeremiah at a young age sensed that. Isaiah had a moment.
Yeah.
Peter had a moment. I had a moment. That sort of thing. And I've never really looked back on that. The thing, though, that I guess the thing that made the contemplative tradition so important for me and so attractive is it finally became the vehicle to know how to not compartmentalize my life. So let me explain that. So in the evangelical tradition, I'm not saying all evangelicals, I'm just saying my experience in my tradition was that I was a part of the Maynard clan. I'm a male. I'm Caucasian. I grew up in a family that had certain economic ideas, certain political ideas. Those were all parts of my life. If you could take a pie chart, you could say, I'm Maynard, I'm male, I'm Caucasian, I'm from the United States, I've got these values, I've got these ideas, and oh yeah, one of those pie slices, I'm a follower of Christ. But I didn't know how that follower of Christ slice was actually supposed to start penetrating and changing all of the other pieces. It was just that slice of my life. And it wasn't until I started to meet the contemplative tradition in Scripture and approaches to Christianity that I started to realize, no, that starts to become the dominant thing. It starts to change who I am as part of the Maynard clan. It starts to change who I am as a male. It starts to change my political ideas and so on. But I had to go through that that door into something that's more contemplative to get there.
Well, so I just to make sure that we're all on the same page, what do you understand a contemplative faith practice to be, or the contemplative tradition to be? How would you define when we say a contemplative tradition? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, so I think the contemplative tradition is, if I could use inward and outward, it starts with an inward life. It practices something that's rich and vibrant on the inward, but it's never satisfied to just simply have a prayer life. It's never satisfied to just simply have some silence in one's life. It's always trying to find that intersecting place where what you're experiencing inward starts to propel you outward as a different human person. So there are indeed these. Saint Anthony, as Richard Foster talks a lot about Saint Anthony. His inward tradition was 20 years in a cave. In essence, he retreated out of culture. And I suppose there's, I think he was doing a lot more than just retreating. I think there was some warfare happening and spiritual battling happening in that cave, in the interior life, as well as out for the culture of the time. But there's moments where you can't stay in the cave. There's moments when you are back as a husband or as a wife. There's moments when you're in a neighborhood. There's moments when you're in a business. There's moments when you're on a reservation. And the mark of that interior life is demonstrated out here, not in here.
I think that's what blew my mind the most about Anthony's story. We talked about him here 2 weeks ago, and what blew my mind was that he'd spent those 20 years in the cave, but then he gets propelled outside of the cave to this kind of major ministry where he's kind of interacting with multiple different groups of people, and even uniting groups of people. And so it just stuck out to me that it was so important that he did have that internal life, which wasn't always positive. And I know for me, sometimes when I think about kind of this contemplative life, you think of something that's kind of warm and fluffy, and I'm going to pray, and I'm going to by myself and meditate, and it's going to be very peaceful. And Anthony went through war. What has been your experience with the contemplative tradition and struggle? How have those things been married in your life?
Absolutely. So I'm 62 years old. I wish I could have made this discovery when I was 32 or 42. It wasn't until I was about 52, maybe 10 years ago or so. So growing up where I did, my father died at a young age. I was about 10 or 11 years old when my dad died. I was the youngest in my family. We're on a farm. My mom was a farmer's wife. Suddenly, her husband is gone.
Wow.
We lost the farm. I couldn't keep it together as a young kid, and so my mom all of a sudden was struggling to figure out what her next step was, and my hat goes off to her for the way that she survived, but it was pretty grim for us for a lot of years economically, and I developed out of that experience. I'm not trying to do a woe is me, because people suffer all kinds of ways, in real dramatic ways. That was my moment. And what I developed from that theory, from that experience, was this theory that finally at the end of the day, I have to roll up my sleeves and work really hard and make something happen, because there's no one that I can turn to take care of me. Wow. Now, I'm a follower of Christ. I would have identified myself as a Christian at that point in time, but I drew some conclusions by my mom not being able to economically thrive, by my family almost going down, by my drawing some assumptions that I'm never really going to leave the reservation. I'm going to work in some laboring job the rest of my life, because there's no money. I mean, that was my moment, and I realized I had some skills in some areas, so I doubled down working really, really hard. All of that to say, I carried that forward into my adult life. I've carried that forward as a pastor. I've carried that forward as a husband. I've carried that forward as a father. I work hard. I work long hours. I make sure if no one else shows up, I'm always there. And it caught up with me finally spiritually when I realized I've got this little slice of my life that is Gene Maynard. I've now added I'm a pastor. I've now added I have some graduate degrees. So I've got my pieces of the pie are there's more to them, but my piece of being a follower of Christ is still about the same size.
And not permeating.
It's not permeating. So I had these spiritual formation, these moments of being in my cave, interior practices of just grappling with that, finally awakened my spirit to the fact, man, all these years that I thought it was up to me, it's never been up to me.
Yeah.
All these years when I thought I had to work extra hard, sure, there's nothing wrong with working hard and being responsible, but it was never about my effort. There's this God who's incredibly for me, and who has resources for me that are unbelievable. So I love this section of Scripture. Paul writes really smart things, like real smart theological things. Ephesians is a book full of unbelievable theological doctrine. The first 3 chapters are just full of doctrines that cause people way smarter than me to scratch their head. Like, how do we wrap our minds around this? He ends that whole section with this prayer. This is spiritual formation at its best. For this reason, like he just said all of these things about who God and Christ are, who we are, our need for him. And then he says it like this: for this reason I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives his name. That's all good. I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. That's great. Now here's the key thing. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to know how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ. And to know that love. Now, let me just clarify. I'm sure you guys all know this. When he says no, he's not talking IQ no. He's not talking intellectual no. He's using a Greek word for experience. I hope that you experience the love of God for you. That was my moment a decade ago, finally recognizing I've got a degree in spiritual formation and I'm still just working hard. I teach spiritual formation and I'm modeling how to work hard as opposed to resting in that love.
So how has your life changed since then? How has your practice of Christianity changed since then? And I want to, and you can weave this in if it makes sense, but I'm curious about your Quaker background too, and looking at the timing, because you said about a decade ago, and you've been with the Quaker Church about 15 years, or you had pastored about 15 years before you moved on to other denominations. So how has your practice of Christianity changed?
Yeah, so in terms of right now, one of the reasons I do long distance hiking, I don't know if I do mountains, but I like doing long distance hiking. I've done some high altitude things, but I love the long distance because it's a non-productive time in terms of getting a goal accomplished.
There's no Wi-Fi out there.
There are sometimes, but you can turn it off actually.
Hey man, where do you make sure to write down where you hike, David? That's where I want to go next.
So my wife and I hiked 500 miles across Spain a few years ago, and it took us about 6 weeks to do it. And I mainly just disengaged, stayed in contact with our kids, but it was a moment where I didn't do anything productive. I just simply walked and walked and walked and thought, and it was some of my unpacking of that. Wow, I have been living my whole life trying to just get from here to here, and I've never actually done it with Christ. That was the start of. That's why I just walk all the time now. I walk miles every day in order to just simply shut down the noise, the hurry, the practice. I'm a better Quaker now. You're asking about that than I was then. Quakers practice a lot of silence, and I kind of grudgingly would practice silence. We have moments like this together in worship, and we'll say, let's sit in silence for a bit. And I'd start watching my watch, and I'd start counting to 300, and then say that's about enough. But it was because I wasn't letting myself just embrace this amazing thing that when you're in God's presence, you need to count longer than 300 for that. You need to just sink into that, and I was getting that from them, not quite getting it, but kind of getting it, and watching Richard Foster and having him come up before I do a message and say, Gene, just give him heaven today, give him
heaven today.
all of that kind of stuff, and I'm going, okay, and I'm finally doing it.
Well, I tell you, we about 2 years ago we took our young people to a Quaker church. We had done this series where our young people didn't really kind of know about our denominational history and our doctrine, and so we did a series where we really taught that, and then we took them out into the world because we wanted them to be able to compare and say, this is what we believe versus what they believe, and also just be comfortable in other spaces. And we went to a Quaker church, and it was probably the one I was the most worried about. We had gone to a charismatic. Lauren, you remember this? When we were in this series where we were visiting other churches, we went to a charismatic church. Oh, we'll be fine there. We went to a Catholic church, and they said there's a lot of up and down kneeling, but we're okay there too. And then we went to the Quaker church, and we visited the churches beforehand, and it was one of those times where we just sat in a circle and we're quiet. And I said, oh, what are the kids going to do? Oh, they're never going to come back to church again. And I know that, I don't know what their experience was, but I know that for me, it is the only church that I've ever been to where when it was done, I was not exhausted. My church, other churches, I'm always after church tired. The Quaker church, I was so rejuvenated after that. And I just would like to hear a little more about Quakerism. I'm not super familiar. I don't know how familiar our audience is, but that is one of the examples of the contemplative tradition. What does that look like for them? And just tell us a little bit about the Quaker history.
Yeah, so just to be real specific, I think anyone that's a Quaker like myself wants to always do this clarification. We're not like the Amish. we're not that group of people that has retreated from culture, but we're actually part of culture. That's just an important distinction, because the Quakerism that I discovered and started to embrace and love more and more, if I can just say that, is that moment. It's that group of people who are trying to put themselves in front of living God, not intellectually, not with a ritual, but with just their hearts open. And as they receive something, it's to go back out into the community. So that spoke to me about my experience on the reservation. My early days in Quakerism was reading people like John Woolman, who in the 1700s was watching slavery on the eastern seaboard and wondering, why does every Christian church, including Quakers at the time, have slaves? He sold a slave as a contract writer, and he went home and thought, what in the world have I done? I've just participated in the selling of a human being. And he couldn't speak for 6 weeks because of that, just the horror of what he had done. And so I was watching that moment of recognizing, man, there is real evil in this world. There's real darkness, there's bleakness, there's lack of hope in this world. And it's actually the presence of Christ that brings the change. It isn't rolling up my sleeves and making something happen, but it's putting my heart making my heart available to God. And as I receive something, to share that in love and in generosity and in peace. And I was watching men and women do that in little ways and in big ways, and looking at political structure, saying, why is that? I was watching this little group of widows in this church I pastored, and they all, I'm not trying to get in any thing at all politically right now, but this little group of widows was staunchly against any military action. It was in Washington, D.C., and they were planning, all of them in their 70s and 80s, all planning to go and protest at the Pentagon. And I would ask them, I say, you guys gonna be okay down there? And they'd look at me and said, oh, we are more than okay. We are agents of Christ to bring a message of peace where there needs to be peace. I was just watching that, blowing my mind open about what this looks like to be men and women of faith, not with a slice of faith, but with it penetrating everything, the culture and the life.
I love that you mentioned just that story about the widows, because one thing that I do like about the Quakers that speak to a healthier practice of the contemplative tradition is that they are very engaged politically. And in fact, they're quite a politically powerful group, a lot of influence on Capitol Hill. And that speaks to one of the potential issues that we can see with the contemplative tradition, right, is this idea that if I'm contemplative in my meditation, in my solitude, in my prayer life, in my building of an inner faith, that then I say, well, I'm not going to be a part of what's going on in the world, and I'm not going to, people can use it as an excuse not to speak to real issues, right, that we're seeing at the time. How do we avoid this in our contemplative practice?
So you have to be incredibly honest. Sometimes in our Christian communities, we're not very honest with each other and with our world. So you need to name it for what it is. I've got a group of, I'm in a church that loves prayer. I mean, we've done all kinds of things to try to increase people's access experientially to the presence of God. And I've got some people that love the prayer gatherings, love the prayer times, love the prayer experiences, and they're doing exactly what you're wanting to do when it comes to living it out. They want to step away, and you have to name it for what it is. It's fake spirituality.
Wow.
It isn't Christian spirituality. It's not Christ breathed spirituality. To be able to look at your brother and sister who's in pain and struggling, whether it's personal pain or something that comes from our societal issues, and to walk the other way, that's not the method of Christ. And so you have to be able to name it. And that prayer group loves it when I do prayer, and they hate it when I call it fake spirituality, and all they want to do is pray. So,
it's interesting because that speaks to, and what I've been learning as I've been kind of preparing for this series is how each of the traditions need each other, right? So like if you just have contemplative tradition without incarnational tradition, you're missing something, right? Are there other potential pitfalls that we can find in the contemplative tradition that we want to avoid?
Sure. So we've already named a major one, which is just valuing the practice for the sake of the practice, and becoming prideful, becoming proud. Boy, I really value silence.
I'm holy.
Yeah. I mean, it's so easy for that to happen. This practice of spirituality like this practice of experiencing God's presence, saying, I'm here, let's commune together, this puts you back into the world in a different kind of way. So recognizing that it's just a small little, thinking that it's just a small little slice, and I've done my spiritual contemplative work, I don't know how to say how large of a danger that is. This has to be just a gateway into life. So that's the one I'm constantly struggling with for myself. Well, I've done that hike, and I've been praying, and I'm good now. I'm not.
Check the box.
Yeah. So I live right. It's just interesting how life gets put together. So I live in Auburn, California. Right across the street, literally across the street, is a native reservation. If you ever go to Thunder Valley, you support the reservation that's right across the street from me. And growing up where I do some of my walking. I walk 5 or 6 miles a day around that reservation. And I find myself seeing and recognizing things I didn't see and recognize back in the day. But one of the things the contemplative tradition is causing me to do as I'm walking is just to pray for the families. I don't know all the names. I don't know all of the people. I maybe never will. But I just walk twice a day around that reservation, and I'm just praying silently. I'm on mission. I mean, I think that's contemplative meeting the world, and I am. I've just been there enough now. Some of the people are coming out and introducing themselves, and I'm getting a chance to. I think that's where it takes us. Just a little, tiny little thing of saying, I'm in my cave. I'm walking and I'm praying, I'm being silent, but I'm not in my cave because I'm here in this neighborhood. Okay. I'm planted here. I think that's how it works.
So, as we're wrapping up, because we're just about out of time, what are some ways that folks who perhaps are not as familiar with the contemplative tradition, who are not Quakers, who are not perhaps going to come and sit for an hour in silence with another group, what are some ways that we can just incorporate contemplative practices in with whatever our stream is that we most easily lean into? What are just some things we can, very practical things, I'm a practical person, what are some things we can add to our lives?
Yeah, I love that, because I am too, and so I like to try to embody this. I'm trying to get it out of the head and try to get it into the body and into practice. So just a real simple thing for me is, I'll share this, you can use it as you want, or use it to create something better for you. But I do something real simple with my hands to try to embody what's going on in my spirit. So I do this at a coffee shop a lot. I was doing it a few moments ago in your worship, and no one knew. I wasn't being obvious or weird or drawing attention to myself. But just simply with my hands, palms down, just simply like this. Sometimes just on a table. I'm there with my laptop working, but I've feeling some stress or feeling some strain or feeling tempted to take issues over and now roll up my sleeves and do the old Gene Maynard thing. So put down my palm, just palms down, and just imagine that God is there with me, He is, and to sort of deliberately breathe some words and say, okay, that tension, that stress, that strain, that temptation, I'm just dropping it. That's why my hands are down. I'm not clenching it. I'm letting it go. And I imagine that the hands of God are somewhere down here catching it. He can catch it. So I just drop. And when I've kind of gotten to the bottom of what it is that's causing that strain for me, flip my hand back over and just simply say, okay, I'm ready to be filled with your presence.
Wow.
To just simply receive what comes. So it often looks very invisible, just like that. No one would know that I'm doing anything spiritual. And then like that. And it's been a game changer for me.
Wow. I can't wait to try that personally in my own life. This week I spent some time. Do you know what LeaderWise is? You've heard of LeaderWise? So LeaderWise is an organization that helps clergy who are either in crisis or help them avoid crisis. And I was diagnosed with depression this week. Right. And so I'm kind of looking at what it looks like now to kind of put some of those tense spaces down. I want to give you guys the opportunity, if you have any, before we let Dr. Maynard go. If you have questions, I'm going to give you the opportunity to ask them. And if you're not comfortable perhaps asking in this setting, we're going to go out to eat afterwards. We're going to go get some Mexican food. Connie is not here, and neither is Terry. So if you know of a good Mexican restaurant, you let me know. That's where we're going. And if you're interested in joining us, please feel free. We'll sit around and talk and eat and enjoy each other's company. But I want to open the floor up for questions. This is an opportunity, and I won't limit you to just stuff on the contemplative tradition. Again, this is a studied man. So if you have questions, raise your hand. Yeah, David. And I'm going to, Baba, there's a mic right here on the stand. Yes. Will you be the mic runner? Sure. Thank you. It should be, I think, one. Is it green? Okay, all good.
Well, thank you for being here. I have a comment and a question, so I'll do the comment
Please.
first, I think. One of the things you were saying, I think having to do with being maybe more subtle in your outreach, especially as you engage the community of Native Americans, where you're not in their face, but it's a thing of becoming familiar in their environment, before you say anything. It brought to mind something Charlie Peacock, if you know him, a musician, and I would consider him a theologian as well, but he said you should, to make sure I don't get this backwards, but it's obvious, is you should know more than you say. Right? So not spilling it all at once and trying to slam dunk your argument. I was reminded of that as you were talking, but my question is, especially when, we're, part of it is, how do you know it's God's voice, because I think it's easy to be led, and the Bible does say the heart is deceitful, and,
right.
and we're trying to let go of things, and yet listen to receive something. It does seem like you could easily go in some direction that is really not godly or not His will for you, and how do you guard yourself against that?
Yeah, great question, and real practically important. So I think there's a few things that you have to just sort of are checks. So first of all, you do have to put yourself in that spot and just say, so God, I'm ready. I mean, with, my spirit's open. Just share with me. I mean, to be actually saying that deliberately opens up the possibility that God could actually lead you, direct you. Your dad, I think, going to Hawaii, that there may be, as you were praying, I was just thinking about that. I was kind of doing this for you, just the tension of that. And please, just show the right place. There could be that possibility. But it also has to find, evangelical tradition for me finally speaks really important. It finally, whatever has been received, it can't be contrary to what's in here. But sometimes I may not understand how to read this because I am a twisted and deceitful human being. And I could make these words be what I want them to be for sure. So I need a community. I need someone to go to and say, Dwight, I was praying and I think I got this. I think it's in Scripture. What do you see? So there's this community importance. We're not isolated. We finally can't just get in a cave by ourselves. We need each other to be able to discern. So
I think, too, that, every King David needs a prophet Nathan, to keep him in check. Every David needs a Nathan.
Yeah, I think there'd be another thing. Just you reminded me of that. Need to be kept in check. There's a mark of hearing from God that makes you not proud and arrogant, but makes you more and more humble. And so to be able, as opposed to being able to say, I've got this, I know this, this is mine, to be able to say, no, I think I've got this, I think I've heard. That changes the equation to have that kind of humility.
If I might, just because of the Native American tradition, I do patient care, so all sorts of people come in, and one woman came in who is a beader, and she does hours of beadwork, and one beautiful thing that she said was she makes sure to include one mistake in her beadwork because the only perfect person is God.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Any other questions while we have Dr. Maynard?
Thanks again for coming. My name's Tim. A lot of us, older here, grew up before our church changed itself, and so a lot of us grew up in we had to be perfect and legalistic and driven by rules and regulations, and it still props up, what you learn when you're 5 and 10, it just seems like you can never get rid of it. What comments would you have for those of us that still suffer from that?
Yeah, that's a great question because we all struggle with that. So my age 10-year-old, that was kind of the window for me. My father was dying of a heart disease, and the word I would use today, knowing more, was that I started to struggle with abandonment. He didn't just walk out, but he still died. I had no one to turn to. So what I was describing to Dwight a few moments ago about rolling up my sleeves and working hard, that was my way, I think, of doing what you're saying, that there's something I picked up at a young age that I continue to do as an adult, even when I knew better. And so it's been important for me. I didn't do the hand thing like I described to you earlier, but I was learning how to do that, to say I've got to drop this abandonment thing. It's getting in the way of my being a husband. It's getting in the way of my being present with my kids because I'm working so hard for a good thing. And I'm putting in so many hours, and I had to learn how to just drop that and say, okay, I'll do what's on my plate, but I can't do more than that. I can't make this happen. So if this mission is from God, He's going to provide for it some way. Hands up, let Him provide. I would suggest the same thing. When you're feeling that age-old thing that you grew up in, I'm laboring under these rules and these regulations and the guilt that sometimes comes from that. To recognize it, the moment you sense it, man, however you would, you have to do it the way I do because we're all different, but let it go, just drop it, and deliberately say, I am dropping this, and God, I'm receiving your grace. And if you do that repetitively, over and over, I'm pretty sure, like He showed me with the abandonment thing, you'll get to the bottom of that thing, and you will one day drop something, receive something, and in that moment you will start becoming a new person. You truly will. God's grace in that. But it takes that over and over and over in new ways, deeper ways. Because you've done it this way, now you can get to something that's even deeper, which then lets you get to behind that to something that's deeper, to finally keep letting it go, so that God of mercy and that God of grace and that God who loves you even if you can't drop your perfectionist ways, he reaches down deep inside. He really does. So I'd encourage you to find your own way, whether it's by walking or reading something and then letting the contrary thing go. But man, push into that. That's the frontier. Push into that. That makes